Hey guys, and welcome to the Grow Podcast. We are so happy that you're here. I'm Ashley, your host for the monthly grain segment of the podcast, brought to you by Landis Grow Solution Center. Today on the grain segment of the podcast, I have Charles Hurburgh on the podcast to really just talk to us about grain management. Here at Landis, grain is a huge thing for us. And so Charles is a professor at Iowa State University. Charles, go ahead. I don't want to do you any due diligence. Introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, thank you, Ashley. I'm glad to be here and to support Landis in helping farmers keep their grain in condition and market it in a way that would help all of us. I'm the leader of the Extension and Outreach Grain Handling and Processing Program. That's Grain Quality Initiative is the handle that we go by. I've been at Iowa State over 40 years, and I've also been an advisor to a number of companies and organizations on grain storage and grain management issues. A number of years ago, I can remember working with Landis on setting up their quality management system. The first one was in Odebolt, I believe. And I can remember going to Odebolt every week for, 6 months or so, setting that up and working with the employees there. And I think the system is still being used across the system. I serve on the Grain Elevator and Processing Society Board of Directors, FGIS Advisory Committee, and the National Standards on Grain Testing and Analytical Equipment. There's a supervisory task force, and I serve on that too. So kind of get around to a number of industry locations, as well as work on grain storage or give advice on grain management and grain storage. And as a free bonus, I'm a member of Landis and our farm is in Rockwell City.
Very cool. Well, when we started talking about what do we want to have next on the podcast, I wanted to personally have somebody come on and talk about grain quality management, especially, as we've seen some weird things that we're going to talk about in this podcast. Yes. And immediately everyone's response that I asked was, you need to get Charles on.
Well, there's a lot of grain in storage right now, an abnormally high amount.
Yeah.
$6 corn going to $4, put some padlocks on grain bins, and it's going to take a little work to get them open. So we've got to keep it in condition so that it's worth its value when they come out of storage.
Well, okay, so let's dive in. So we talked about, I wanted to have you on the podcast because you are kind of the keeper of the grain quality and grain management knowledge, it seems, in the industry. And so I think, as you just alluded to, as we start to think about where the corn prices currently are, and you mentioned, the downfall, although for our listeners, if you haven't been paying attention, the grain market has really started to come back since the low on February 23rd-ish. And so definitely, if you are not paying attention, clue in.
It's called Reward the Rally.
Reward the Rally. You heard it here. So keeping grain in good condition is more important probably now than at $7 corn, right? Most could say. So I want to start off, and before we get into the nitty gritty about this year's grain or anything more, give us just a few basics. I mean, every operation is different, but give us a few basic practices when it comes to managing grain, maybe some tips. We might have some young farmers that are listening that this might be, some of their first years here.
Well, the first thing I tell people is what you do at harvest and the few weeks surrounding or after harvest probably has the most to do with your future grain storage than anything else. Mm-hmm. Cool the grain immediately. Don't hold grain that is warm. We had that situation. We'll get to that in a little bit. We had that situation this year. It was hot during harvest. Mm-hmm. And if we didn't take the time to get it cool, it will shorten the storage time later on. You won't see it until winter or after winter, but later on, why do I have hot spots? Where's all this coming from? And it's what you do at harvest. So you want to cool the grain, and this is corn and soybeans. And I realize that some of them, like soybeans, for example, are usually dry. I tell a lot of people, you can make a mess of dry corn just as easily as you can make a mess of wet corn. If you don't cool it uniformly, dry it uniformly, keep track of what's going on, you can have problems in dry grain, just especially if it doesn't get cooled immediately. The key thing to look for is dew point.
Okay.
They give it on every weather report, all newscasts and so forth. But if there's a big difference between the dew point temperature, colder than the outside air temperature, that's good times for cooling.
Okay.
Because the grain will cool because of moisture evaporation.
Mm-hmm.
The air will cool to, won't quite get to the dew point, but it'll get close. I mean, it's a good approximation of where it'll get to. So, for example, in the last few days, we've had reasonably warm temperatures, but dew points in the 20s, sometimes lower than that. That is ideal grain cooling weather because grain will get down to those lower temperatures or close to it.
Okay.
So pay attention. The dew point is kind of your key indicator as to whether you can do a pretty good job of grain cooling or not. And the years when we have problems, the years where we have storage issues with either bins or piles or flat storages or whatever, it's usually the years when we've got a lot of humidity in the air and the dew point and the actual temperature are close together. You don't have much to work with.
Yeah, you don't have a difference there.
Don't have a difference. You don't have much to work with in cooling, and you don't have much to work with in drying. Because if there's not much difference between the dew point and the outside air, it's not going to dry very well. It's not going to dry very fast. It'll just sit there. So that's the biggest thing that I always tell people is getting the grain cool. The second biggest thing is take the center cores out of the grain.
You want to say that again for all of our listeners?
The biggest thing, I'll come back to that in a bit. I'll come back to the center cores because this is the year you want to do it twice. But that's 5 to 10% of the grain, something in that order. Enough that you get a good cone down when you pull one or two loads or however many you take. Depends on the size of the bin. Obviously, if you have a very large bin like 100,000, 200,000 bushel bin, it's a little harder and maybe a little bit more stress to take out 10% of it than it is in a 10,000 bushel bin. But you want to get a cone down because that takes out a lot of the fines and the trash that inevitably congregate in the middle.
Okay.
Many of you may have grain spreaders in the top, and that sort of spreads the cone of fines out a little bit, but it still doesn't relieve the problem of concentrating the small material that restricts airflow and is usually wetter in the middle or near the middle. And then to the outside, the bigger pieces, and then the whole corn tends to roll to the outside. This has a very big effect on the uniformity of the airflow in a bin. Air's as lazy as I am. It'll go away. It'll take the path least resistance, which is usually somewhere up around the edges and or someplace off the center where the fines are and where you'd like it to have to go. So that's the purpose of taking the core out. And if the grain makes fines, if it's more prone to breakage than usual, and that's the case this year because of the dry weather and the incomplete fill, then you get broken grain and fines, and that simply adds to the issue of non-uniform airflow. So take the center cores out. Obviously, if you have a flat storage, you've got a little bit more of a problem with that because you're not going to find one place that takes
a true core
to get a core. No, you won't do that. And if you have a flat storage or a pile, we can talk about piles later if you wish, but if you have a flat storage or a pile, consider, and I know this takes away weight, but consider cleaning the grain because that takes out the fines and makes the overall storability much better. The fines, if fed immediately, are pretty good feed. They're usually 75% or so of the value of the corn, so it's not a loss. It can be they will spoil quickly. Don't hold on to them, but it's not a loss, and so but the value of taking them out, if you have a flat storage or some irregularly shaped storage that doesn't just have round sides, is big. Value of taking the fines out. Try to harvest similar moistures in a bin. Be a little bit cagey about which fields you pick and and so forth in a given bin, so that you don't have so much equalization problem, and you're not relying on the dryer to even it out, because you may rely on the dryer, but it won't. There's still 3-4 percentage points of difference between the wettest and the driest, usually in any given situation. So try to make similar moistures and similar test weights. Test weight's the best indicator of storability we have. Light corn is pretty much guaranteed to be more of a storage problem. For want of better numbers, 52 pounds and under, you could expect storage problems. It just doesn't store as well, and it goes out of condition more quickly at a given moisture content. So try to balance that out. And if you know, this is where your marketing plan comes in. If you know that you've got an end user that has to have corn in June, July, August, September, like an ethanol plant, has to have corn. Well, choose which corn you kind of decide you want to put away for storage. Drier, heavier. You'll have less problems later on. You won't be nearly as likely to be forced to bail out of it.
Yeah. So talk a little bit more, and if you can't give specifics, that's okay, and maybe it's just a textbook answer, but at what temperature should corn be cooled down to?
Below 40. Freezing's okay, though.
Okay. Talk about that a little bit.
Freezing's okay as long as you have clean corn.
Okay.
If you or beans, either one. I mean, normally we don't think about beans so much for moisture, because it seems like there's always a week when soybeans during harvest will get down to 6 to 10%. And then we're griping about losing the weight, not the moisture.
Yes.
But beans the principles are still the same for corn or beans. But anyway, you'd kind of like to keep the heavier corn for your long-term storage.
So tell us then what percentage, right? So I think we're seeing fuller maturities being planted, and so they're coming out of the field wetter. So at what percent moisture do you feel like is best for storage quality?
You can keep corn up to probably 17 if you keep it cold.
Okay.
For a while. And there's a standard relationship between moisture and storability. I publish that every year in the Integrated Crop Management newsletter. And the storage time goes down as the moisture goes up.
Okay.
17 is kind of my view of the compromise that you can get, a couple, 3 months of storage, particularly through cold weather. And that's important if you're feeding livestock, because we all know that they digest and it's more palatable, and you're getting full weight, basically. The most ideal moisture to sell grain is when you get a small moisture discount, because you don't give away any weight.
Yeah.
You get the full weight. Yeah, you get discounted a few cents, but you also had more weight. So my rough rule of thumb is 17. Now, professional storage folks like yourself will often go up to 19 because they will normally get some drier corn through the winter and early spring. And so with careful management, you can keep 19% corn for a couple of months if you keep it cold. But in a farm situation, I wouldn't go over 17.
Okay.
And then you need to know that corn will have to be handled either sold or dried at some point, probably about now.
Yeah.
We've had a tough year for that this year because it's been so warm, and then it's been so cold, up and down. We've had a tough year for that. But anyway, that would be kind of my guidance. And if you have wet corn in storage, plan to look at it frequently. Don't be afraid to go. Well, we've got stairs now, so even old guys like me can get up into a bin and look at it if you have to, because you got the spiral staircases. Used to be you didn't have that. It was basically a steel ladder, and you looked up.
Yep.
And sometimes we didn't take as often a look as we needed to. But anyway, and temperature cables. My friends in the bin construction business say maybe 20%, maybe 25% of bins actually get the cables installed.
Okay.
It's several $1,000s for an installation and up, depending on the size of the bin. Don't short on that. Please don't short on that. Put the cables in if you have a chance, because they will give you an advance warning that in a bigger bin,
something's going wrong.
Yep. And you won't see it. You can walk the top of a large bin and you won't know it until you get that faint odor that makes the hair stand up on the back of your neck.
Yep.
And by that time,
it's too late.
You've probably got some difficulties somewhere, and you'll find them when you core the bin next and see where you've got a spoilage problem. Yeah. So the cables pay for themselves. They really do. And the higher the grain value, the more the cables pay for themselves. Yeah. And the bigger the bin, the more the cables pay for themselves.
Oh, for sure. All right. So we've touched on a little bit. We've had a weird year. And so I'd love to dive into what, were crop conditions like as we look back into harvest, and then what potential risks do you see happening to the corn? So kind of some things that come to my mind is we might have had some lower test weight corn come out of the field early.
We might have, particularly if it was severely drought damaged, we might have.
Yeah. And so it was also a very dry crop for most of the state, right?
Well, except for Northeast Iowa that got rain at the fall. Yes. And then there's some wet corn in storage in places, not in the West Central Trade Territory, not really. But there was some, and there was some desire to cut down on the use of the gas, and so there's corn in storage that's probably a little bit wetter than it ought to be right now.
Okay. So walk us through kind of those two positions. Yep. One, it came in dry. What are our potential risks here as we think about that storage quality? And then also maybe for the customers that might have a little bit wetter corn.
Well, the corn that came in dry, the harvest was warm. The corn came in temperature warm. And back to where I started at the beginning. The first thing that you should do is get the corn cold. And if it's not cold now, and however you can take the temperature, whether it's just manually with a thermometer on a rod, which will get you down maybe 6 feet or so, or temperature cables, and those are in the 50s or above, let's be turning fans on right away. Okay. Because especially now, I'm just looking out the window. It's a nice warm day and the humidity is low. What that means is it's good corn cooling weather. Okay. Even though the temperature itself is, well, I think it's 50s anyway. I don't remember. I think I saw that on my truck thermometer that it was 50s coming down here. So even at that, the dew points are probably in the 30s. And if so, good corn cooling weather. Time to get those temperatures down, especially if we want the corn to stay in condition clear into July, August, September. And remember, our biggest user, which is ethanol, they have to have 1/12 of their corn every month. So it has to make it through to the end. Damage hurts ethanol plants. It doesn't ferment as well. So we've got more challenges than we used to in terms of corn storage. Iowa is a net importing state. We actually use more corn in Iowa than we grow, even though they're the largest production state in the country. With the animal feed, the corn wet milling, the corn dry milling, we use more corn than we grow. So we need corn in July, August, and September, and we need corn in decent condition. So it's basically temperature. If you haven't cored your bins, do it now. If you have, do it again. The drought-damaged corn, or the drought-stressed corn, tends to break up in the handling process. And so even after you take the core out, you may have created in the process of filling and so forth, you may have created more fines than you know. Okay. So take the core out and take that opportunity to look down through the pile and see if there's any issues. Corn standing in a pile or something like that. Yeah. That's a good way to to find out if you've got impending problems. So dry corn, if you had dry corn, the problem you may find is what's called blue eye. All your folks know what blue eye is. All your grain superintendents know what blue eye is, and it's a bad word because it grows very slowly. It's a kind of a line down through the germ, and it counts as damaged corn in the grades. Grows very slowly, will grow at low moistures. If the temperatures are warm, say 70 degrees, the blue eye will just get slowly worse. Doesn't heat that much, doesn't generate that much heat, but aeration, once you get to that point and it's in the middle of the summer, aeration is probably not going to do much help for you. You're just moving air through it, and it's not going to take the blue eye out, nor is it going to stop the development of it.
Yeah.
So that's probably what you'll see.
Okay.
And the degree to which you see it will give you some idea of what you really might want to do. I'm a big believer that if you start to have spoilage, nothing's going to get any better. It's not going to go away and vanish. And so at that point, move it into commercial hands and get it on the road.
Pass the risk off.
Pass the physical risk off and get it on down the road and market it. There are ways to set price without necessarily having the physical sale and the price setting at the same time. And I'm sure you go through that every day.
Yeah.
So that's my advice. When and if you have some of this corn starting to get discolored a little bit, let's move it on. Let's get it on out of here because ethanol doesn't really want discolored grain. Swine don't want it. They get gut problems. Beef cattle are a little bit more tolerant.
Yeah.
The wet corn that's still wet, if it's still wet now, and it's 17, 18% now, dry it now or have somebody dry it. Pass it off and have somebody dry it. Because that for sure is going to be a all summer problem. If it has started heating, which it probably has, if it's 18, 19% now, then it's not going to get any better.
Yeah.
Move it on. It was warm. The biggest problem I see is that it didn't get cool immediately after harvest, and so it started to spoil a little bit, and that's just an invitation to continue.
Okay.
And hard to control it.
Okay.
You'll need to dry that. And I suspect that some of your facilities have dryers running. And that happens every spring. And in some parts of the state, Northeast Iowa and places, it's probably pretty common.
And so with that, let's get into, we had, as you said, abnormally kind of warm fall. And then we really didn't get super, super cold.
Yep.
But now we've had these fluctuations, right? It was like almost 80 degrees last week or the week before. And now it's freezing again, temperatures. So talk us through, what does this look like? You hear around Landis, we talk about customers been sweating. Talk us through what's that like? What can a customer do to really, protect himself from this?
Regular, more frequent than normal aeration with dry air is the way to handle that. Okay. What the sweating comes because moisture does move. If you don't aerate it, even if it's cool and sweet at harvest and it's sitting there, if you don't aerate grain, there will be slow-moving currents of air in there that might not be so slow when you start to get 80 or so degrees outside in the cold corn. There's where you get the sweating problem, which is why I said aerate it probably more frequently. So anytime you pull the air down through it, obviously you're going to change the temperature of the grain. Roof fans allow you to take the sweating on the roof out without having to change the temperature of the grain.
Okay.
As you clear the roof peak out, and you may have to run them 2 or 3 times in a week to keep, if you have very cold grain in the bin and it gets you get it warm and more humid, you're probably going to get some sweating in the top. The roof fan is the cure for that.
The next thing, I just want to cover is if you're sitting here and thinking, oh my gosh, I haven't done any of these things that we have talked about. If I haven't ran my fans, I haven't cored my bins yet. As Charles mentioned earlier, you can do a little bit of risk management, pass the risk off. And just a reminder, we do have options to be able to move your grain into, the elevator and be able to take that grain risk quality off your plate. So I just wanted to mention at many of our locations, we have free price later open. And if that's not your jam, we also have our extended price program open, which is where you can, set your basis and leave your futures open. So if you have any questions about that, or if you're thinking, gosh, I'm kind of nervous now, feel free to call the Growth Solutions Center and just really talk to someone about the options that you've got. And just kind of as we wrap up here, I just definitely wanted to mention, as I kind of alluded to earlier, a couple of things on the grain marketing topic. First and foremost, since the recent lows on February 23rd, the market on the DEES 2024 board has rallied just through the roof, at least 20 cents here today. And so we're just always talking about rewarding the market. And so since that low over the last few weeks, we've just seen a really big board rally. We've seen some farmers really reward the market and move some grain, take quality risk off, but also, get back to a little bit of a price rally, right? And so we're always fans of rewarding the market, especially when it comes to new crop too. In the last couple of years, we've really seen the farmer undersold heading into new crop. And so this is a great time to review your numbers, know your break-even numbers. And it certainly feels like this year we're headed into another new crop, DEES 2024 being undersold as the farmer is just bullish. He feels like we should be back to those higher numbers, which
you're not entitled to anything.
I don't disagree, but yes.
The market never entitles anybody to anything.
No. And, I loved your comment. We need to reward the rally. And that's what we always say too, is keep putting in and hope that it gives you back. All right. And lastly, I just wanted to certainly remind our customers and farmers that we have a really, really big report coming up on March 28th. We will see the USDA release the acreage report. In-house, we often refer to this as the planning intentions report. And it truly is the first look at what the USDA believes will be planted, corn, beans, wheat, and all the crops across the United States. And it's really the forefront for our originators and merchandisers to be able to figure out what might be happening. And so I know a lot of our customers have been getting surveyed on, do you have any acreage shifts? And so thank you so much for that information, and, continue to share that with us as we figure out what does corn versus beans look like potentially this year.
That's going to be a big struggle this year.
Yeah.
One point that I didn't mention that has to do with this risk management. If you have grain that you hadn't done much to in terms of storage maintenance or whatever, and then all of a sudden we think, well, gosh, we've got to aerate this quite a bit in order to get the temperatures down, maybe get rid of some hot spots or something like that. Consider the cost of the lost water in your equation of, should I move it? Should I just move it to market and pass the physical risk on to the elevator or the processor or not? If you take moisture out below 15% moisture, and that will happen if you selectively aerate on some of these low dew point days, you could take out some moisture. If your corn is of high enough moisture, 15, 16, it's probably not going to matter. But if you have a lot of dry corn and you take more moisture out, that's 6 to 10 cents a percentage point. The weight. In soybeans, it's even more, 15 to 20 cents a percentage point. But just be sure to factor that weight shrink into your quality management strategy and think about whether maybe moving it on might get around some of that and maybe keep some of that money, or maybe I want to take the risk or accept the fact that I'm going to be selling 13% moisture corn in the summer. Factor that into the calculation.
Yeah, for sure. Okay. Well, I just want to thank all of our listeners for listening and tuning in today. And just really thank you, Charles, for coming on and giving you some of your great intelligence on this topic. And it's truly an important one. especially as, here at Landis, we're starting to see a little bit more damage come through. And so be sure, if you're not checking those bins, be checking those bins.
Yep.
Again, thank you for listening, and be sure to subscribe so that you never miss an episode, whether it be agronomy or grain.